The ballroom in Sundown, the Cleghorn family property in the Waikiki Hills, remained in absolute silence that October morning 1889. French silk curtains filtered the tropical light, creating gold patterns on the Steinway piano that no one else played. In the center of the room, a 13-year-old girl remained motionless in front of a Venetian mirror, her small fingers adjusting the pearl necklace that weighed like a chain in her delicate neck. Princess Victoria Kaʻiulani Kawekiu Lunalilo Kalaninuia Hilapalapa Cleghorn, heiress of the throne of the Kingdom of Hawaii, did not know she was dressing for exile. The reflection that stared back at her was not just that of a real child. It was that of an entire island about to be erased from history. If you, like us, are fascinated by the forgotten stories of women who lived under the weight of invisible crowns, consider subscribing to the channel. These narratives of beauty, power, and ruin deserve to be remembered, and you won't want to lose any of them. Victoria Kaʻiulani was born on October 16, 1875, in Honolulu, daughter of Princess Miriam Likelike and Scottish businessman Archibald Scott Cleghorn. It was the niece of King Kalakaua and the future Queen Liliuokalani, positioned as second in the line of succession to the Hawaiian throne. His birth occurred in a moment of growing tension. The Kingdom of Hawaii, which had maintained its independence for decades, was being systematically pressured by American commercial interests that saw not only a tropical paradise, but a strategic position in the Pacific. Kaʻiulani's childhood has gone through a world of contradictions. On the one hand, he lived surrounded by the luxury typical of royalty: piano, French, English literature, European label classes. On the other hand, he grew immersed in Hawaiian culture. He learned hula, listened to his grandmother's old songs, knew the legends of the gods who danced in the volcanoes. It was a child who existed at the intersection of two worlds, the West that colonized and the peaceful that was his inheritance. But there was something deeply melancholy in the way she inhabited these spaces. Photographs of the time show a big-eyed girl and serious, always impeccably dressed, but with a look that seemed to look for something beyond the camera lens. Even at the age of 10, Kaʻiulani carried the weight of representing not only a royal family, but an entire civilization under threat. In 1889, when Kaʻiulani was only 13 years old, one decision was made that would forever change the course of his life. His father, Archibald Cleghorn, a pragmatic man formed by the British commercial logic, concluded that the only way to prepare his daughter for the uncertain future that he was heirs was to send her to England. He argued that a European education would make her more respectable in the eyes of Western powers, more able to navigate international diplomacy that would be necessary to save her kingdom. The farewell occurred at the Honolulu Pier on a May morning. Kaʻiulani, dressed in a navy velvet travel set with white lace details, remained erect, while hundreds of Hawaiians gathered to say goodbye to the princess. There were no visible tears. She had been trained since she was a child to keep the real composure. But witnesses report that when the ship began to move away from Porto, it turned back only once, and at that moment its face revealed an expression of absolute loss. What followed was a decade of golden exile. Kaʻiulani was installed in Great Harrowden Hall in Northamptonshire, under the care of Theo H. Davies, a Welsh businessman who had made a fortune in Hawaii. The property was magnificent. Impeccable gardens, vast library, halls decorated with Persian rugs and paintings of European masters. But for a girl who had grown barefoot on Waikiki's beaches, those cold corridors were an elegant prison. The education he received was exemplary, according to the Victorian standards. He learned German, perfected his French, studied European history, classic literature, painting, music. He became a young woman with impeccable refinement, able to discuss philosophy in 3 languages and play Chopin with a technique that impressed visitors. But behind this cultivated perfection, something essential was being systematically erased. The letters I wrote home, preserved in family archives, reveal a growing sadness disguised in formal language. She described the dances she attended, the tours through the English gardens, the visits to London museums. But between the lines, an abyssal loneliness was transparent. He was a princess being trained to save a kingdom that might no longer exist when she returned. At 17, Kaʻiulani had become a young woman of extraordinary beauty. His mestizo heritage, the golden skin inherited from the Hawaiian mother, the eyes CL Scottish father's rims, created an appearance that fascinated London society. It was exotic enough to be considered intriguing, but polite enough to be accepted in the most refined circles. The descriptions of the time are unanimous in pointing not only their physical beauty, but the natural grace with which it moved by aristocratic halls. He wore dresses of Worth and Doucet, jewelry that had belonged to Hawaiian royalty, but always with a simplicity that contrasted with the typical ostentation of the late Victorian era. It was as if instinctively understood that his strength resided not in excess but in containment. But this beauty, far from being an advantage, became another form of exile. The young men who courted her saw a tropical curiosity, a fairy tale princess. The women of society treated her with a cold courtesy that barely disguised envy and prejudice. She was simultaneously desired and isolated, admired and misunderstood. The correspondence of this period reveals a young woman increasingly aware of her impossible position. It was too polite to easily return to Hawaii, but too Hawaiian to be truly accepted in England. Her identity was being fragmented by the years of exile, and she was beginning to realize that perhaps there was no place in the world where she could exist in full. In January 1893, Kaʻiulani's worst fears came true. A letter from his uncle, lawyer Sanford Dole, arrived at Great Harrowden Hall bringing devastating news. A group of U.S. businessmen, supported by the United States Navy, had knocked down Queen Liliuokalani. The Kingdom of Hawaii had ceased to exist. Kaʻiulani, then 17, experienced a pure and uncontrollable fury for the first time in his life. The young woman who had been trained since childhood to keep the real composure locked in her rooms for 3 days, refusing to eat or receive visits. When he finally emerged, he had made a decision that would change the course of his last years. He would go to America and fight for the restoration of his kingdom. The trip to Washington, D.C. was organized quickly. Kaʻiulani, accompanied by Theo Davies, settled on the New Willard Hotel and began a desperate diplomatic campaign. He was an 18-year-old trying to convince one of the world's most powerful governments to undo an annexation that enormously benefited American interests in the Pacific. The photographs of this period show a remarkable transformation. The young princess of melancholy expression had given way to a woman of railroad determination. He wore sober costumes, always in black or navy, as if he were perpetually mourning. And in a way it was beyond a kingdom that had died while she was on the other side of the world. Resistance performance. Kaʻiulani's strategy to conquer American public opinion was simultaneously brilliant and tragic. She instinctively understood that her biggest weapon was her own person. Young, beautiful, educated in the best Western standards, speaking a perfect English with a slight accent that only accentuated her exoticism. It became the palatable face of Hawaiian resistance. He gave interviews to newspapers across the country, always photographed in poses that balanced real dignity and female vulnerability. His statements were carefully elaborated to touch the heart of Victorian America, an orphaned princess fighting alone to save her people. The press loved her. It was an irresistible story, the 19th century Pocahontas. But behind this calculated performance, Kaʻiulani was paying a devastating emotional price. Each interview, every public appearance, every smile for cameras was an extra fragment of your soul being consumed by the need to represent something bigger than herself. She was no longer a young woman with dreams and fears. She was a symbol, a trophy in the war of narratives about the future of the Pacific. The climax of his campaign took place in March 1893 when he got an audience with President Grover Cleveland. Dressed on a black satin costume with Hawaiian pearls, she performed at the White House with dignity that impressed even the most cynical advisors. His speech was brief but devastatingly effective. It did not ask for charity, required justice. Cleveland, perhaps touched by the young princess's sincerity, or perhaps calculating the political costs of annexation, promised to investigate the events in Hawaii. For a moment it seemed that Kaʻiulani had achieved the impossible. The victory was ephemeral. American commercial interests in Hawaii were too powerful, and the strategic position of the islands too valuable to be abandoned because of the calls of a teenage princess. In July 1894, the Republic of Hawaii was officially recognized by the United States. The kingdom had definitely died. Kaʻiulani Re'ebeu, the news in his room at the New Willard Hotel. There was no drama, just a deep silence that extended for hours. When he finally spoke, it was just to ask them to prepare his luggage. She would return to Hawaii, not as an heiress princess, but as a citizen of a republic she did not recognize. The trip back was an emotional Calvary. The ship that brought her crossed the same Pacific she had crossed 5 years earlier as a hopeful girl leaving for education that would save her kingdom. Now he was returning as a premature girl aged by defeat, carrying with her not the crown she should inherit, but the ashes of an extinct civilization. Honolulu in 1897 was an unrecognizable city. American ships filled the port, the streets boiled with continental traders, and the old Hawaiian songs had been replaced by English Protestant hymns. Kaʻiulani, who had left as the second in the line of succession to the throne, returned as a historical curiosity, the last princess of a kingdom that had become folklore. She settled again in Sundown, the family property that now seemed haunted by the memories of a lost era. The halls, where real balls were once taken silent. The Steinway piano, covered by a white cloth, looked like a musical sarcophagus. Kaʻiulani wandered around the house as a ghost of his own youth. The years of exile had profoundly transformed their relationship with their homeland itself. She spoke Hawaiian with the fluency of those born there, but there was something slightly strange in her accent. 10 years in England had left invisible marks. He intimately knew the culture of his people, but I now see her with the eyes of those who had learned to watch her out. It was simultaneously native and foreign, belonging and exile. In the absence of a kingdom to govern, Kaʻiulani began to carefully build a public persona that would allow him to maintain some relevance in the new social order. He became a refined hostess, organizing social meetings that mixed the Anglo-American elite with the surviving Hawaiian aristocracy. His parties were famous for the discreet elegance, never ostentatious but always impeccable. She wore a calculated simplicity that distinguished her from the wives of American planters, with her dresses loaded with lace and excessive jewelry. He preferred fluid fabrics and earthy tones, minimal but always significant jewelry. A koa bracelet, Hawaiian pearl earrings, a necklace made with native seeds. It was as if, through fashion, she had a silent resistance to the Americanization of her land. But this carefully built persona hid a growing loneliness. Kaʻiulani never married, despite the various proposals he received. Some biographers suggest that he had fallen in love with a young English during his years in Great Harrowden Hall, but that the romance was unable to the circumstances. Others point out that she simply understood that any marriage would be inevitably political, and she had lost the ability to enter alliances that were not authentic. The last years of Kaʻiulani's life were marked by a growing melancholy that she disguised under a mask of serenity. He woke up late, spent hours reading in French and English, played piano for a hearing of silent employees. Its afternoons were occupied with long walks by the property, always alone, always impeccably dressed in solitude. The photographs of this period show a woman of still extraordinary beauty, but with something broken in her eyes. She had learned to smile at the cameras with a technical perfection that completely hid any genuine emotion. It was a porcelain smile, beautiful, cold, fragile. His only moments of apparent genuine happiness occurred when he was with Hawaiian children. She discreetly sponsored native schools, financed medical treatments for poor families, had a loving correspondence with dozens of young Hawaiians who had known only the American Republic. It was as if he tried to be the mother of a generation who would never know the kingdom she had lost. In 1898, Kaʻiulani began to have symptoms of a disease that doctors of the time could not diagnose properly. He lost weight quickly, suffered from inexplicable fevers, experienced a deep fatigue that no treatment could relieve. American doctors who examined it suggested a variety of causes, from malaria to neurasthenia, nervous disease in fashion among women in high society. But those who knew her closely knew that Kaʻiulani was dying of deeper affliction than any medicine of the time could treat. She was dying of sadness, such a deep melancholy that she had become physical. It was that ancient Hawaiians would call poino, death that comes when the soul can no longer find reason to inhabit the body. His last months had been spent almost entirely in sundown, in the company only of his Scottish stepmother and some faithful employees. She stopped receiving visits, canceled all social commitments, withdrew to a silence that seemed to extend infinitely through the empty corridors of the house. Princess Victoria Kaʻiulani died on March 6, 1899, at the age of 23, in her bed in sundown. There was no dramatic agony, just a gradual fading, like a candle that is extinguished when there is no wax to feed the flame. His last days have been spent in a sweet semi-command, muttering words in Hawaiian that no one around could fully understand. The funeral was a strange and melancholy event that perfectly captured the contradictions of his life. The official ceremony took place at St. Andrew's Cathedral, an Anglican church built by the American missionaries. But the procession that followed to the royal cemetery was accompanied by the sound of traditional Hawaiian songs, performed by hundreds of natives who gathered spontaneously to say goodbye to the last princess. She was buried dressed in a simple white dress, without jewelry besides a small maile necklace, the Hawaiian sacred leaves that her grandmother had put on her neck when she was still a child. In their hands, they put not a Bible, but a small book of Hawaiian poetry that she had copied by hand during her years of exile. After his death, Kaʻiulani's memory was systematically romanticized and, paradoxically, emptied of its political meaning. The American press turned it into a fairy tale figure, the tragic princess of a lost paradise. His political struggles were minimized, his strategic intelligence was ignored, his resistance was reduced to an exotic charm. The following generations of Hawaiians grew up listening to stories about the Princess of Flowers, who had died of unresponsive love, longing for his Christmas island, sadness for the loss of his kingdom. It was a convenient narrative that transformed a complex political woman into a harmless figure of cultural nostalgia. The official portraits left of it always show the same pose, profile, looking beyond the camera with a poetic melancholy expression. It is as if it had been transformed into a tropical lady of Shalott, condemned to observe the world only through reflexes, never allowed to participate directly in real life. The story of Kaʻiulani is, fundamentally, the story of a woman who was trained for perfection in a world she conspired to make this perfection irrelevant. She received the best education that money could buy, was shaped to be a consummate diplomat, developed a beauty and a grace that enchanted everyone who knew her. But all this was in preparation for a role that ceased to exist before she could assume it. There is something deeply cruel in the way she was prepared to save a kingdom that was already condemned when she left for exile. His parents, his tutors, the entire network of adults responsible for his formation, knew that the chances of preserving Hawaiian independence were minimal. But they continued to shape it as if it were to take over the throne, as if education and refinement were enough to stop the historical forces that had already decided the destiny of the Pacific. The tragedy of Kaʻiulani was not just personal, it was emblematic of what happens when entire civilizations are erased in the name of progress. She personified the impossibility of existing between worlds, of being simultaneously Hawaiian and Western, native and polite, authentic and performative. Throughout her adult life, Kaʻiulani carried the weight impossible to represent something bigger than herself. She couldn't just be a young woman with desires, fears, personal ambitions. It was the incarnation of a people, the symbol of resistance, the last hope of a civilization. This responsibility deprived it of a genuinely private existence. Every word, every gesture, every choice of clothing were interpreted symbolically. He could not fall in love with freely. Any romance would be analyzed through political lenses. He could not express weakness or doubt. It was the princess, and princesses need to be strong. He could not even show anger. Women of his position should always keep the composure. The resulting loneliness was almost ontological. It existed in an injunction between the public and the private, between the personnel and the political, between individual desire and collective responsibility. It was seen by thousands, admired by crowds, but fundamentally misunderstood by all. Decades after his death, the figure of Kaʻiulani continues to haunt the imaginary Hawaiian, but in a fantastic. She became an absent presence, a memory of something that has been lost but never properly cried. Its image appears in museums, history books, cultural performances, but always filtered through a fog of nostalgia that obscures both its complexity and its contemporary relevance. What was lost in the romanticization of its history was precisely what made it more interesting. Its political intelligence, its ability to manipulate symbols and narratives, its sophisticated understanding of the dynamics of power that were reshaping the Pacific. She was not just a victim of the historical circumstances, she was an active participant, even though ultimately unsuccessful in the resistance to colonization. His true heritage does not reside in the romanticized images left of it, but in the demonstration that it is possible to maintain dignity and resistance even in the face of inevitable defeat. She has shown that there are ways of power that do not depend on victory, forms of resistance that transcend immediate political success. Princess Kaʻiulani's story confronts us with an uncomfortable truth about the price of beauty when it becomes political, about the cost of perfection when it is imposed as an obligation, about the subtle but devastating violence of cultural erasure disguised as progress. She represents all women who were trained to play papers that the world later decided that she no longer needed. All those who received primer educations for realities that ceased to exist, all who carried on their shoulders the weight of representing entire civilizations, as their own souls will be able to solve representation. Ultimately, Kaʻiulani reminds us that there are forms of colonization that are more subtle than military conquest, more devastating than economic domination. There's the kind of conquest that disguises on education, which promises elevation while promoting uprooting, which offers refinement in exchange for the soul. His reflection on that Venetian mirror in Sundown, a 13-year-old girl adjusting pearls that weighed as chains, continues to face us through the centuries, silently asking, how many other princesses were trained for perfection in worlds they conspired to make this perfection irrelevant? How many other women died from the melancholy of existing worlds, beautiful and broken, educated for a future that would never arrive? The answer echoes in the empty corridors of history, where other female voices wispy their own historical tragedies, waiting to be heard above the silence that still, even now, tries to claim them.